My name is Dustin Reynolds. I was 34 when this happened, and for most of my life I would have told you straight that men saw what they expected to see in the dark. I worked underground, kept my bills paid, checked my own fences, and trusted weight, distance, and tracks more than stories. If you had asked around our hollow, people would have said I was dependable and hard to shake, maybe too quiet, maybe too stubborn, but practical. I believed in bad weather, loose rock, old machinery that could maim you, and men making mistakes. I did not believe in monsters. Then Cotton Gin Road made a liar out of me. I was third-generation mine labor, same as my father and his father before him. My shift started before dawn, when the ridgeline was only a darker stripe against black sky, and every truck in the lot wore a thin skin of dew. I would wake at 4, drink coffee standing at the kitchen counter, pack 2 sandwiches and a bruised apple into a dented lunchbox, then drive down from the hollow in my old half-ton with the heater coughing warm air that smelled faintly like old dust and antifreeze. By the time we clocked in, helmets and lamps were on, and talk had narrowed to what mattered: roof conditions, belt speed, where the foreman wanted us cutting, who had called out. Underground time worked differently. You measured the day by machinery noise and body strain, not sunlight. I spent 10 to 12 hours in black seam and narrow work zones where every surface sweated mineral damp and grit stuck behind your teeth. At the end of shift, when we rode back up and peeled off gloves, my shoulders burned, and my ears rang from the constant mechanical pitch that never fully left, even in bed. The drive home climbed past old fence rows, kudzu-choked ditches, and a line of half-dead pines where the county stopped pretending to maintain anything. Cotton Gin Road was patched asphalt at first, then broken tar, then gravel that narrowed between timber and drop-off until 2 vehicles could not pass without one easing onto the shoulder. Home sat near the end of that road. Not a farm in any formal sense, just family land cut into useful pieces over decades. My place was a weathered 1-story house with a tin roof and a porch that leaned an inch lower every spring. Behind it sat a shed for tools and fuel, a pole barn, and a chain-link run where I kept Boone, my beagle, when I was gone long hours. Below the house, the land dipped into a lower field with 3 head of cattle I kept, mostly because my father could not stand seeing pasture go empty. Past the field, hardwood timber thickened along the drainage and rose toward the ridge in tight oak and hickory. My father lived in the older house, uphill, 200 yards, by the footpath and farther by truck, when rain washed ruts out. Since my mother died, he had gone quieter each year, like part of him had settled into stillness and did not plan on moving again. We saw each other most days, usually at dusk. I would bring him groceries, propane, or parts he pretended he did not need. He would ask practical questions in that dry tone he kept for everyone, including family. "You eat yet?" "Not yet." "You check the lower fence?" "After I wash up." "Generator still sputtering?" "Only under load." He would nod once and say, "Bring your socket set tomorrow." Like that was a full conversation. For a while I resented how little passed between us that was not work or maintenance. Later I understood that for men like him, steady presence was the closest thing to saying I love you. I was also trying to rebuild something with my ex-wife Kayla, though rebuild might be too generous. We had divorced 2 years earlier after too many nights where I came home spent, took a shower, and stared at nothing while she talked around me, trying to reach the part that still felt available. She said the mine had taken my attention in chunks until there was not enough left for us. She was not wrong. After the paperwork and the boxed-up dishes and the quiet that followed, we fell into a careful kind of contact. Shared insurance forms, occasional dinners in town, messages about her nursing classes and my father's blood pressure. We were not trying to pretend the old marriage could be revived by force, but we were trying to prove we could be decent to each other. On Tuesdays, if my shift ended close to schedule, I drove to the diner by the river and met her for coffee and whatever pie had not sold out. She watched me with that direct nurse brain attention, always assessing. "You sleeping any better?" she asked once, pushing creamers toward me. "About the same?" "That means no. It means I sleep when I get tired enough." She held my gaze a second longer than comfortable. "You know that is not the same thing." I gave her a half smile. "You still grading my answers?" "Only when you give bad ones." Those evenings were the closest I came to normal life outside work. I hunted in season, freezer first, not trophy first. I kept calibers clean, boots by the back door, and weather apps checked before I went into any deep draw. If I tracked anything, I tracked with a notebook. Date, temp, wind, direction, sign, estimated size. I trusted repeatable patterns. Deer crossed where they crossed. Hogs rooted where mast dropped heaviest. Coyotes tested fence lines after midnight, then looped wide. Even when events got messy, the land usually told the truth if you knew how to read it. By the second week of October, our hollow had that late fall look, where color turned rusty and thin, and evening came down fast behind the ridge. Smoke from wood stoves hung low over the road near dusk. The creek ran shallow but loud over exposed stone. I worked double shifts for 8 straight days because 2 men were out with injuries. And management did what management always did, filling gaps with whoever had not yet learned to say no. I was exhausted enough to skip dinner and eat crackers at the sink, exhausted enough to stand in the shower and forget whether I had shampooed already. Even then, routine held. Feed dog, check locks. Walk the perimeter with a flashlight. Look in on Dad. Set alarm. Sleep. The first odd thing looked small and easy to explain. Boone, who usually dragged me off the porch, with his nose to the ground the second the sun dipped, stopped at the top step one evening and planted all 4 paws like he had hit a wall. His hackles rose from shoulders to tail, and he gave a low whine I'd only heard during thunderstorms. I tugged the lead once, gentle. "Come on, buddy, you know this yard." He leaned back harder, eyes fixed past the shed toward the lower timber. I crouched and ran my hand along his neck, heart hammering. Not excited, scared. I figured maybe a coyote had cut close, maybe bobcat scent, maybe one of the neighbors' loose dogs. I took him back inside and did the yard check alone. Light sweeping fence posts, brush line, barn corners. Nothing moved. No eye shine. No sound except leaves clicking together in a weak breeze. The next evening, the cattle in my lower field were bunched tight near the far gate, all 3 facing the same stand of oak by the drainage ditch. They were not grazing, not restless in the usual way before rain, just standing shoulder to shoulder with heads high and ears pointed forward. I walked halfway down the slope and called to them. One gave a short, sharp bawl. Then they compressed tighter. That set a needle under my skin. Cattle spook for reason. Dogs, coyotes, scent from a predator, lightning pressure, something. Still, I told myself it was likely feral dogs pushing along the tree line. We had packs roam through every few years, especially when folks dumped animals after hunting season. On the third night, the insects cut out in pulses. That is the best way I can describe it. Not a full stop that stayed stopped. A wave of silence rolling in from the timber, holding for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, then churring and rasping returning in patches, before cutting out again farther up slope. I stood on my porch with my work boots unlaced and listened to that pattern move through the dark, like somebody was turning sections of the night on and off. I tried to convince myself it was temperature drop and wind channels in the hollow, some quirky acoustic effect I had never noticed, because usually I was too tired to stand and listen. But the rhythm felt deliberate, and the hair on my arms rose each time silence reached the yard. The morning after that, I found the first scrape marks, fresh bark peeled from an oak near the edge of my lower field, 4 parallel grooves running nearly 7 feet up. I measured with my tape, because that is what I do when something is unclear. 6'10" to top gouge. The cuts were not broad and blunt like old bear sign I had seen in county photos. These were narrow, deep, and clean-edged at the start, with torn bark flared downward near the end as if whatever made them had pulled through with force. 10 yards away, in a muddy patch by the drainage, I saw tracks that began looking canine in heel and pad shape, but stretched oddly through the front, with long toe impressions, too narrow for bear and too large for any dog I had ever handled. I squatted there for 10 minutes, comparing measurements in my head against every animal I knew in those woods. Rain came hard that afternoon, enough to flatten dust and wash shallow prints. I figured that would clear whatever scent trail had Boone spooked. Instead, when I stepped out after dark to secure a tarp over feed bags, a sour, wet fur smell sat heavy near the shed. Not rot exactly, not skunk. More like damp kennel layered with old iron and stagnant water. The rain had cooled everything, but that smell hung in one pocket of air and refused to move. I checked behind the shed with my light. Nothing. Another evening passed, then another. Boone still would not leave the porch after sunset. Cattle still bunched before full dark. I found one more oak with fresh scrapes at almost the same height, and twice I heard heavy steps pacing just beyond my floodlight range, a 2-beat pattern in wet leaves that was too measured for deer and too heavy for coyote. Step, step. Pause. Step, step. Always just outside the bright cone, tracking parallel to the yard, then fading toward the drainage when I advanced. I ran explanations like a checklist, because fear without structure can own you fast. Poacher with dogs. Feral pack mixed with something larger. Black bear with mange standing upright to mark. Teenagers trying to scare the mine guy on the dead-end road. Fatigue from doubles turning ordinary sounds strange. Every theory had 1 or 2 details that fit, and 3 that did not. I would settle on one answer while brushing my teeth, then discard it the next morning when I saw another mark too high, too deliberate, too wrong in shape. Late one Friday, I sat in my truck outside my father's place, with engine idling, and watched his porch light throw a narrow yellow rectangle across his steps. He came out with a coffee mug, looked at me through the window, and tapped the glass. I rolled it down. "You look like you slept in a ditch," he said. "Long week." He took a sip. "You checking those fences again tonight?" "Yeah." He studied my face a second longer. "Hollow nerves," he said finally. "Gets in a man this time of year. Wind moves different. You start hearing things." I wanted to tell him about the scrapes, the tracks, Boone freezing at the threshold, the pulsing silence. I wanted him to look serious and say, "I have seen that too." Instead, I nodded like his answer was enough, because I was not ready to say out loud that I was running out of normal explanations on my own land. I drove home in full dark, with my high beams painting the trees white and flat, and for the first time since I bought that place, the last half-mile of Cotton Gin Road felt like entering territory that did not belong to me anymore. I eased the truck into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat with both hands on the wheel listening to it tick down. The porch light burned steady, Boone's shape moved behind the front window, and the floodlight over the shed washed the yard in that chalky white that usually made me feel in control. That night, it only made the shadows look sharper. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the chamber on my sidearm out of habit, and stepped out into cold air that smelled like wet leaves and creosote from somebody's stove down the hollow. Boone started barking from inside, short bursts, then a drawn-out whine that rose and broke. I walked a slow perimeter, beam cutting across fence posts, the chain link run, the barn doors. Halfway to the lower slope, the insect noise dropped out so completely that my own breathing sounded intrusive. Then I heard it again. Step, step. Pause. Step, step. Not rushing, not circling wide anymore, just pacing parallel to me from inside the timber at a distance I judged around 40 yards. I swung the light toward the sound and caught nothing but trunks and briar, slick with reflected glare. The pacing stopped the moment my beam touched that section of woods. I stood there counting in my head, waiting for a deer blow or a coyote yip or any ordinary cue that would let my nerves settle around a known thing. Nothing came, not even wind. I backed up the slope instead of turning my back, got Boone out for a fast leash walk on the porch boards only, then locked him in and checked every window latch twice. Sleep came in fragments. Every time the house creaked, I came awake already reaching for the light. By Sunday evening, the signs had multiplied enough that my notebook started to look like a field report instead of hunting notes. 2 fresh scrapes appeared on separate trees along the same contour line above the drainage, both between 6'8" and 7 foot. I measured, photographed, and marked each location with orange tape I usually reserved for property line work. The mud near the lower gate held 3 partial impressions that started with a canide heel, pad shape, then stretched forward into long, narrow toes, with deep punctures at the tips, like weight had shifted onto claws at push-off. Stride length varied in a way I could not reconcile, alternating between what might have been a large dog lope and something closer to a bipedal step pattern that overlapped itself. Mixed tracks in soft ground could create false readings. I knew that was true. I also knew these did not look accidental. The cattle changed too. They stopped ranging the lower half of the field altogether and wore a narrow loop into the grass near the barn side, where the floodlight reached. One had a shallow scrape along its flank, not deep enough to bleed much, but too high and clean to be barbed wire. Boone quit barking after dark and switched to silent staring. He would stand rigid by the back door, nose lifted, then retreat to the laundry room and press against the dryer like he wanted to disappear into metal. I had seen gun-shy dogs, storm-shy dogs, dogs that hated fireworks. I had never seen him act like he expected something to come through a wall. On Monday, I found hair caught in the twisted corner of my chain link gate, where it met a steel post. Not deer hair, not cow hair. The strands were coarse, dark at the root, paler at the tips, longer than coyote guard hair, and with an oily feel even after rain. I folded them into a clean sandwich bag, labeled it with date and location, and put it in my freezer next to vacuum-sealed venison, because I did not trust room temperature to preserve anything useful. That same afternoon, I discovered the first damage to property that made denial harder. 4 grooves scored the plastic bed liner of my truck just behind the cab, each maybe 5 inches long, spaced too evenly to be random scrap from tools or lumber. I ran my fingertips through them and felt edges still sharp. No dust settled in. Fresh. I carried the notebook up to my father's place at dusk. He sat at his kitchen table peeling an orange with a pocket knife, radio low in the corner. I spread the photos out beside his mug and watched him squint through reading glasses he hated wearing. "You see this set?" I said, tapping the print with the track impressions. "Toes are wrong for bear. Too long for dog. Scrapes are over 6.5 foot. Boone won't leave the porch. Cattle are crowding the light side every night." He chewed a section of orange and stared at the table for a while before looking back at me. "You running doubles, not sleeping, and walking around outside listening for trouble," he said. "That can turn any hollow strange." "I'm not guessing at this. I measured it. I'm not calling you a liar." His voice stayed flat, but softer than usual. "I'm saying fear can make patterns where there are none." I felt my jaw set. "And claws in my truck bed are a pattern too?" His eyes flicked up at that, then away. "Could be somebody messing with you." "Who comes up that road just to score plastic and leave?" He folded the orange peel into a neat spiral on the table. "Lock your doors. Keep your lights on. If it is a person, they'll move on when you stop giving them a reaction." It was almost funny in a bleak way. I had asked for backup and gotten philosophy from a man who trusted silence more than evidence. I left before either of us said something we could not take back. At the mine the next morning, I mentioned the marks to Curtis while we changed in the locker room. He had worked belts for 20 years. Heavy set, calm under pressure, not the kind of man who jumped at rumors. I kept it practical, no talk of monsters, just sign and damage. He snorted while lacing his boots. "You spent half your week hunting a broken power transformer with teeth," he said. "Get 1 full night of sleep and those woods will go back to being woods." I gave a dry laugh because that was easier than arguing. "Maybe. Set cameras if it bugs you. Catch your prankster on video. That shuts folks up quick." "Already planning it." He slapped my shoulder. "There you go. Facts." Facts. That word kept me steady, at least during daylight. Tuesday should have been diner night with Kayla. I texted that I was tied up setting cameras and kept the rest to myself. She called once to check in, and I told her work had me wrung out. I spent that evening installing 3 trail cameras and 1 old motion camera I had used for monitoring a feeder site. Camera 1 covered the lower gate where the tracks kept appearing. Camera 2 watched the shed corner where the smell pooled after rain. Camera 3 aimed upslope at the scrape line near the taped trees. The old motion camera I mounted under the eave, facing the truck and porch steps. I used fresh lithium batteries, checked seals, formatted cards, and snapped test frames with timestamp verification. I logged each placement with compass direction and estimated range in my notebook. If this was a bear, I would catch size and gait. If it was feral dogs, I would see pack behavior. If it was a man, I would have his face or at least movement pattern. 3 days passed before I pulled the cards. Camera 1 had no captures, not even deer, despite obvious traffic in that lane. Battery dead. Camera 2 had 6 corrupted files and then blank space as if recording had stopped mid-cycle. Battery showed full when I removed it. Camera 3 powered on but produced only static bands and one still frame at 2:13 in the morning. 2 amber green points high in the image, level, wider apart than any eye shine I had cataloged for local wildlife. No body, no depth reference, except a sapling trunk in front, and those reflections were above it by at least a foot. The old motion camera under the eave had been turned 15 degrees off angle, screws still tight like it had been pushed instead of loosened. I took the frame to the county deputy office after shift, sat under fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired, and waited while Deputy Keller finished paperwork. He was polite in the way officials get when they are trying not to laugh in your face. He studied the photo, zoomed in, and leaned back. Could be glare, he said. Could be a deer at weird angle. Night optics do odd things. Deer eyes aren't 7 foot up. Depends on grade and lens distortion. My camera was level. I tested it. He slid the print back across the desk with 2 fingers. You got livestock damage, we can log a nuisance predator complaint. Wildlife officer might set a trap run, but unless somebody saw an actual person trespassing or got attacked, this stays low priority. I've got property damage and tracks too large for dogs. He gave a short shrug. Feral dogs can surprise you. So can black bears standing up, especially in low light. I watched him exchange a quick look with the younger officer behind him. The kind of look people think you miss when they have already decided what category you belong in. I stood, folded the photo, and said, "Log the complaint anyway." He nodded. "Done." External contact made. Outcome dismissal with paperwork. I drove home feeling angrier than scared for maybe the first time since this started. By the end of that week, the wrongness became tactical. That is the only word I have for it now. Floodlights that had worked for years began tripping in staggered bursts, never all at once, as if movement kept crossing the edge of each sensor without entering the center. One night I stood on the porch with a thermos and watched the shed light click on, hold 6 seconds, click off. 10 seconds later, the barn light fired. Off. Then the lower fence light. Off. The sequence moved left to right along my property line and stopped at the timber. Boone tracked each activation with his head, body shaking hard enough the tags on his collar rattled. I started carrying a handheld spotlight, in addition to my regular flashlight and staged flares by both doors. I moved a trauma kit from my hunting bag into the kitchen cabinet and packed a second one in the truck. I checked lock screws, reinforced the back strike plate, and parked nose out for fast departure. I told myself these were not panic behaviors, but contingency plans. Same logic as checking methane monitors underground before every entry. Preparation meant control. Control kept fear from taking over. That was the framework I forced myself to stay inside. On a fog-thick night 2 days later, I got my first direct visual that could not be filed under maybe. I had stepped off the porch to secure the gate latch before bed, headlamp on low, because the mist reflected too hard on a high beam. Visibility was 30 yards at best, the kind of white murk that flattened distance and erased depth. I heard one branch pop from the timber edge and lifted my lamp. At first I saw only condensed droplets flashing in the beam. Then 2 reflections appeared between saplings up the slope, amber green, fixed and level, set wider than a man's hands spread apart. They sat at a height I estimated around 7 feet, based on the tagged scrape tree behind them. Not bobbing like deer, not weaving like a curious dog. Still, deliberate. I shifted left 3 steps without taking my eyes off them. The reflections moved with me, smooth, lateral tracking through brush, maintaining spacing and height. No body resolved in the fog, just those points, and a sense of mass hidden behind them. I felt my pulse in my gums. I kept my breathing through my nose, stance stable, and fought the urge to run blind. The eyes blinked once, both at the same time, then went dark as if somebody had pinched out 2 coals. No crash through brush followed, no retreat noise. Just fog and silence settling back over the yard. I backed onto the porch, locked the door, killed interior lights, and watched through the slit beside the curtain for nearly an hour. Nothing showed. At 1:40 in the morning, the shed motion light tripped and stayed on long enough for me to see Boone's water bowl rattle on the porch boards. From a vibration I felt through the floor. One heavy impact landed somewhere outside my view, close enough that a framed photo on the wall ticked crooked. Dawn came gray and windless. I went out armed, every muscle tight, and followed the porch line to the truck. The new marks were on the driver's side door and bed rail, shallow at first, then deeper across the rear quarter panel. 4 parallel drags that cut paint to bare metal. On the mud below, the rocker panel sat one clear impression. Longer than my hand from heel to toe, narrow through the midfoot, with claw punctures at the front, and a pressure ridge that suggested weight transferring forward like a lunge stop. Whatever made that print had been close enough to touch the house and strong enough to leave metal scored like soft wood. It had not wandered through by accident. It had come up to the door, tested the truck, and left on purpose. I stood over that print until my calves started to shake, then crouched and set my tape beside it with my phone recording. 14¼ inches from rear pad edge to claw puncture. Just under 5 across the widest part. The claws had punched clean through the mud crust into compacted soil beneath, and the pressure ridge in front was crisp enough that I could see where each tip dug in at a slightly different depth, like a hand gripping while it braked. I took photos from every angle, dropped a carpenter pencil in frame for scale, then cut a rough square around the impression with my trowel, and pressed a plastic tote over it so sunlight would not dry it out before I could cast it. My fingers worked from habit, steady and precise, while the back of my neck burned with the feeling of being watched from just past the shed corner. I checked anyway. Shed door, latched. Barn aisle clear, timber edge still. That sour, wet fur odor rolled past once on a weak gust and disappeared before I could track direction. Boone stayed inside, rigid near the laundry room doorway, eyes fixed on me like he was waiting for me to make the right decision. I almost laughed at how stupid that thought was, but it did not feel stupid in that moment. I shut every blind in the house, boiled water for coffee I did not need, and laid out what I could actually control. Sidearm cleaned and loaded. 12 gauge by the door. Spare shells. Spotlight charged. 2 road flares on the counter. Phone battery pack plugged in. Truck keys on a hook I could reach in one motion. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of old steel. Low clouds pressing down on the ridge until the timber line looked flattened. I mixed plaster in a feed bucket and poured the print cast slow, letting it settle so bubbles could rise. While it cured, I walked the yard with my notebook and mapped each new mark on the truck against earlier damage. Same spacing pattern. 4 grooves, parallel, no chatter in the cut lines, all pulled in one smooth direction. Not random scraping from tools in the bed, not brush strike, deliberate contact with force behind it. I wrote that sentence twice and crossed it out both times because seeing it in ink made the situation feel less arguable. I carried the cast inside at dusk and set it near the mudroom heater to dry. The shape looked wrong, even in plaster. Canted logic in the heel, then length through the forefoot that made no sense for any local animal I could name without stretching into fantasy. I ate standing at the counter 2 bites of leftover venison and half a biscuit, then gave up and poured it in Boone's bowl. He sniffed it and turned away. At full dark, I stepped onto the porch with the spotlight and swept the yard in tight arcs. Fence, gate, barn, lower field shoulder. Nothing moved. Insect noise stayed steady for 10 straight minutes, enough to loosen the knot in my chest by maybe 1 notch. Then it cut out in one clean wave from right to left, like someone drawing a blade across fabric. I killed the spotlight and let my eyes adjust. Cloud cover had thinned just enough to bleed pale light into the upper branches, turning trunks into vertical bars, and the gaps between them into dark wells. I heard one soft branch tick, not snapping, just pressure on wood and release. I lifted my headlamp, kept the beam low so backscatter would not blind me, and waited. The eyes appeared where the lower timber began, higher than the top rail of my chain link gate, farther apart than a deer by a wide margin. Bright amber green with a reflective depth that looked less like shine and more like light, held behind glass. They were level, not peeking around a trunk, not rising from a crouch, already there, fixed on me with a steadiness that felt clinical. I shifted 1 step to my right. They moved the same distance through the trees, without bobbing, without changing height, smooth as a camera pan. Every practical part of my brain started throwing labels at the scene. Owl reflection on wet bark. 2 separate animals lined up by chance. Lens effect from my own light. Anything built from normal pieces. I narrowed my beam, trying to catch ears, shoulder, breath fog, any contour I could match to flesh and bone. Nothing resolved except those 2 points, and the faintest suggestion of a darker mass behind them that vanished when I focused directly at it. I could hear my pulse in my left ear, thick and uneven, and I realized I had stopped breathing deep enough to think clearly. I forced a slow inhale through my nose, counted to 4, let it out, and kept my stance square to the timber. The eyes blinked once. Both lids closed and opened together, no head tilt, no startle. Predators blink off rhythm when they are uncertain. Dogs glance away. Deer stamp and snort. This did neither. It watched me like I was a variable in a calculation it had already done. I backed up 1 board at a time until my heel touched the threshold. Boone whined behind me but did not bark. I eased the door open with my left hand, never taking the beam off that line, then stepped inside and pulled the door shut without a latch click. Through the narrow slit between curtain and frame, I tracked those reflections for another minute as they shifted laterally behind saplings, always parallel to my position in the kitchen window, then cut out all at once. No retreat noise followed, no brush crash, just the insect chorus returning in fractured patches, then filling in whole. I did not sleep. I sat at the table with every light off except the stove clock, writing times in my notebook each time I heard something outside. 10:42, one heavy impact near shed side. 11:17, two beat steps on gravel by truck. 12:03, porchboard creak at far corner, no follow-up. At 1:11, a low chuffing exhale drifted from the backside of the house, rough and pulsed. 3 short pushes, then silence. I held the 12 gauge across my lap and stared at the dark over the sink until first gray light bled through the blinds. Morning gave me nothing clean to grab. No fresh print at the porch. No new gouges in metal. One place by the shed where leaves were pressed flat in an oval, like weight had settled there and shifted once. That was it. If I had not written the times down, I could have convinced myself I dreamed half of it. I carried the dried plaster cast to my truck anyway and drove to my father's house because I needed another set of eyes on something solid. He met me on his porch in a flannel shirt with one cuff button wrong, coffee in hand. I set the cast on his railing and waited while he studied it. He ran a thumb over the claw marks and frowned. "Big dog," he said. "Show me a big dog with that toe length." Ground can stretch tracks. Not in cured plaster. He looked past me toward my truck, then out toward the ridge. "What do you want me to say, son?" "I want you to stop acting like this is in my head." His jaw tightened once. "I want you to stop standing outside at midnight proving something to the dark." We stood there in that old family silence, both of us too stubborn to give the other a clean bridge. He lifted the cast and handed it back like it was hot. "Keep lights on," he said. "Do not go into that timber alone after sundown." It was the closest thing to belief I got from him. By the following night, low fog had settled in the drainage again, and the temperature dropped fast after sunset. I skipped dinner, drank coffee until my hands buzzed, and repositioned one trail camera higher on a fence post to eliminate ground glare. I also moved my truck 50 feet downhill, nose pointed toward Cotton Gin Road, so if I needed to leave, I would not waste seconds turning around. Those were practical choices. The less practical truth was that I did not trust the yard anymore and wanted a clear retreat lane. Around 9, my porch floodlight flashed once and died. Not tripped. Dead. I checked the breaker panel, reset it, got power back, then watched the bulb fail again after 30 seconds. Old wiring could do that, especially with moisture, but the timing landed like a taunt. I took the spotlight and walked to the truck to pull a spare bulb from the glove compartment. Halfway there, I felt that same pressure at my back, the unmistakable sensation of attention focused from one direction. I spun, beam cutting through mist, and caught the eyes again at the timberline. Same height, same spacing, closer by maybe 10 yards. They did not retreat when the light hit. They held. I spoke without planning to, voice rough and too loud in the quiet. "Get on out of here." No reaction, no sound. The eyes tracked left as I moved left, smooth and patient, then vanished behind a thick oak trunk. I shifted right to reacquire and found empty dark. I stood there long enough for my shoulders to start aching from tension, then replaced the bulb, locked Boone in the bedroom with the radio on low, and sat in the driver's seat with engine running until midnight, headlights aimed at the lower field. Nothing crossed the beam. Nothing stepped into open ground. At 12:26, I drove a slow loop down Cotton Gin Road to the old mine cut and back, partly to clear my head, partly to prove to myself that roads and trees and abandoned equipment still obeyed ordinary geometry. 3 nights later, The moon came out hard and bright after a day of cold rain, and every puddle along the road reflected like broken glass. I had just come from checking on my father's generator and was heading home with a milk crate of parts in the bed when I saw movement near the inactive loader parked off the old spoiled turnout. At first I thought it was a person stepping from behind the front tire, maybe a trespasser scavenging copper. I braked and angled the truck so my headlights washed the slope. The figure stopped in profile against the pale mine spoil and did not look human anymore. Distance was around 80 yards, maybe 90. Enough for error. Not enough to explain what I was seeing as a trick of light. It stood upright with shoulders so high and broad, they broke the line of the loader's wheel hub by a clear margin. Its torso tapered sharply from chest to waist, then flared into hindquarters built like coiled springs. The legs bent backward at the lower joint in a way that made my own knees hurt just looking at them. Digitigrade posture like a canid forced into biped stance, but moving as if that was its native configuration. Forelimbs hung long, almost to mid-thigh, ending in hands, not paws, with fingers flexed and slightly spread. The head sat forward on a neck that rose too straight from the shoulders, muzzle elongated, ears tight back against the skull. No fur detail at that distance beyond a ragged outline. No color beyond dark mass against lighter ground. But the proportions were wrong in too many linked ways for my brain to smooth over. I shut off the radio because some part of me believed silence might help me interpret motion better. The engine idled rough, ticking through the steering column into my palms. The figure turned its head toward the truck in one deliberate arc and held there, as if weighing distance, wind, and approach options. Then it took 3 steps down slope. Step 1, covered ground, like a man taking 2. Step 2, landed without visible stumble on loose spoil rock that should have rolled under weight. Step 3 brought it behind the loader tire and out of full view except for the top of its shoulders and the crown of its head moving through the gap above the rim. It had gone from static silhouette to tactical use of cover in less than 2 seconds. I put the truck in reverse and eased back until my rear tires hit firm gravel, never taking my eyes off that gap. The thing did not charge. It did not show itself fully again. It shifted once, enough for moonlight to catch an edge of profile, then went still. I waited, counted to 30, then to 60. No movement, no sound, but engine idle in my own breath. When I finally pulled away, slow at first, then faster, I checked the mirror every 3 seconds until the turnout dropped behind a bend. By the time I reached my driveway, my hands were trembling so hard I fumbled the key twice at the door. Boone met me with a low, steady growl he had never used on me before, then recognized my scent and pressed against my legs. I sat on the kitchen floor with him until the shaking passed, replaying that profile in my head frame by frame, searching for any ordinary animal template I could overlay on it. Bear with mange did not fit the leg structure. Man in costume did not fit stride length or shoulder mass. Misread shadows did not step with jointed precision across spoil rock and take concealment behind heavy equipment like trained movement. I tried to convince myself fatigue had finally crossed a line, that long shifts and bad sleep and weeks of hypervigilance had turned distance and moonlight into a nightmare shape. I listed every factor that could distort perception: headlight angle, reflected glare, moving cloud cover, expectation bias, adrenaline. The list was long and logical and almost persuasive until I closed my eyes and saw that silhouette again, upright and waiting by the loader, built like nothing in any field guide I had ever trusted. I stayed on the kitchen floor until Boone's breathing slowed and my own pulse stopped pounding in my teeth. The house had that late-night stillness where every appliance click sounded too sharp, and the clock over the stove seemed louder than it had any right to be. I got up, checked each lock again, then stood at the sink and looked out through the narrow gap in the blinds toward the yard I had known most of my life. Nothing moved under the floodlights, no eyes at the tree line, no shape crossing the lower field. Ordinary scene, if you ignored what I had just watched at the mine turnout. Wind pushed in from the ridge, near midnight, hard enough to make the porch tin chatter. 10 minutes later, rain followed. First as scattered taps, then a full sheet that turned gravel to black gloss and filled every low spot with ripples. I told myself the weather was a gift, because heavy rain usually flattened scent and movement and bought a quiet night. I stripped off wet work clothes, pulled on dry jeans, and sat at the table with my notebook open, trying to write down the silhouette proportions before memory bent them. Shoulder height relative to loader tire, arm length to thigh, leg angle at lower joint, head carriage. I wrote 3 pages and still felt like I was missing the one detail that would convert fear into a category. The back motion light kicked on at 12:37 and held. Not flicker held, but steady, like something stood in its center. Boone came up from the hall and froze beside my leg. He did not bark. He pressed close enough that I felt him trembling through denim. I looked through the rear window above the sink and saw only rain slicing through white glare and the dark line of the barn beyond. Then the light snapped off. 3 seconds later, the shed light came on. Off again. Then the lower fence light. Same staggered sequence I had watched before, but faster, tighter, like a practiced pattern instead of random triggers. I grabbed the spotlight and stepped under the porch roof, staying out of the rain. Water hammered metal hard enough to blur smaller sounds, but underneath it I caught a low impact from the chain link run. Then a second impact, spaced just far enough apart to suggest testing, not panic. I swept the beam toward the run and got only rainburst and reflective mesh. Another hit landed, this time at the gate by the barn lane, followed by the thin ring of vibrating wire. Boone let out one strangled whine behind me and backed into the doorway. Lightning flashed somewhere over the next ridge, flattening the whole property into white for a split second. In that instant, I saw it at the chain link gate by the barn. Not full body, partial. Enough. It stood angled to me, maybe 30 yards out, one arm braced on the top rail, head lowered toward the latch as if inspecting mechanism rather than forcing entry blind. The rain had soaked the fur down so individual clumps showed along the neck and shoulders. Dark black-brown with lighter streaks, where water ran off guard hairs. The muzzle was long and narrow, more wolf than dog, but set on a neck that rose too vertical from the chest, giving the head a lifted, almost human line of sight. The ear shape was triangular, but pinned tight back. Its free hand closed around chain link in a fingered grip I can still see clear as daylight. Long digits, knuckle definition, pale curved claws, extending beyond the links and catching reflected light like bone. It pulled once with controlled pressure, felt the gate flex, released, then shifted 2 steps sideways without crossing its feet the way any canid on hind legs would. Efficient, balanced, purposeful. The flash died and darkness slammed back in. I hit the spotlight where it had been, but rain and angle gave me only fragments. Shoulder mass moving behind post, a profile cut of muzzle, an eye flare that burned amber green and then vanished as it turned away from the beam. I could hear it breathing now, a rough chuff in short pulses, not panning, not growling, or like air pushed through a constricted throat in measured bursts. 3 short exhales, pause, 2 longer, pause, patterned enough to register as deliberate communication, except there was no second animal visible. I should have gone inside and stayed there. Instead, I stepped off the porch and moved toward the barn wall to improve line of sight. Rain soaking my shirt in seconds. Every survival lesson I had ever trusted was fighting inside me at once. Keep shelter, keep distance, maintain visual contact. Do not corner yourself. I edged to the barn corner and used it as cover. Spotlight low to cut backscatter. Another lightning pulse lit the lower yard, and I caught it again farther downslope, now clear of the gate and moving along the fence line with head low, shoulders rolling under wet fur in heavy, smooth cycles. The hind legs bent backward at the lower joint and drove it in long, elastic strides that looked wrong only until you saw how much ground each step ate. It was not stumbling through mud. It was choosing path and footing with care. I realized then it had shifted downwind. The breeze had turned toward the house with the storm front, and the creature had angled to keep my scent cone in front of it while staying outside the strongest light. Hunting logic. Tactical behavior. Not random aggression. A cold weight settled under my ribs that had nothing to do with rain. I was not dealing with an animal blundering near a farm. I was being assessed. It stopped by the feed barrel stack near the barn lane, half obscured by shadow, and lifted its head. For 1 second, lightning gave me a clear side view from shoulder to muzzle. Scars crossed the flank in old pale lines where fur had grown thinner. Water dripped from exposed canines when it opened its mouth slightly, not in a snarl but in a focused, scenting pull. The chest was barrel wide and deep, with muscle layering that made the 4 quarters look overbuilt compared to waist and hips. I could not reconcile any of it with bear, cat, dog, or man. Every familiar reference broke at a different point. My hand started to shake so hard the beam jittered. The creature's head snapped toward that movement. Even at distance, I felt the lock of its attention hit me like physical force. No bluff left in me then, pure primal fear. The kind that strips language down to one directive. Get to hard cover and live. I backed to the barn door, found the latch by touch, and slipped inside the aisle with the spotlight off. Rain thundered on the roof, turning the interior into a loud metal cave. I stood in dark with my shoulder against rough plank, listening for footfall pattern outside. Nothing for 10 seconds. Then one heavy thud against the outer wall near where I'd just been standing, hard enough to shake dust from rafters. Another thud lower and farther right. Then silence again, broken only by rain and Boone whining from the house uphill. I stayed there until my knees cramped. When I finally risked the door crack, the yard looked empty. Gate hanging slightly skewed. Feed barrel tipped on its side. No visible shape. I did not step out. I moved from barn to porch in a crouch, locked the door behind me, and sat on the kitchen tile with the shotgun across my lap until dawn washed the windows gray. Morning gave me evidence too specific to argue with. The chain-link gate had a new inward bow at the latch side with 2 link diamonds stretched open beyond normal flex. Mud on the top rail stood at a height just over 7 feet, where something had leaned weight. On the post cap I found 3 shallow gouges in galvanized metal, curved and parallel. Near the feed barrel lay a hand-like impression in wet soil, partial but clear enough to show finger spacing and claw puncture at the tips, pressed deeper on the outer edge as if weight shifted during a pivot. I photographed everything, cast the best print, and bagged 1 tuft of coarse wet fur snagged in the gate twist. By the next evening the rain had passed and the hollow smelled scrubbed clean, that sharp leaf and clay scent that usually resets my head. It did not reset anything. I was running on adrenaline and caffeine, and every sound carried too much meaning. I drove down to check my father's generator, stayed 20 minutes, then headed back just before dusk. Halfway home, I realized my orange tape markers from the scrape trees were gone. Not fallen, gone. I found 1 strip tied in a tight knot around my mailbox flag at the road. Another was looped through the handle of my shed door, cinched so hard I needed pliers to remove it. I did not remember telling anyone where those markers were. I walked the property in full daylight and found more rearrangements that looked small until you lined them up. The carpenter pencil I had used for track photos was stuck point first into the porch post at chest height. My left work glove, missing for 2 days from the truck cab, sat on the top step with mud smeared across the palm in 4 narrow streaks. A spent 12-gauge shell from my ammo shelf, one I kept as a keepsake for my first deer with my father, was placed upright on the hood of my truck, dead center above the grill. Boone refused to cross the threshold to sniff any of it. He stayed behind my legs, low and silent. I called Kayla from the porch because she was the one person who listened before deciding what was plausible. She answered on second ring, hospital noise in the background. "You okay?" she asked immediately. "No," I said. "I need you to hear me out all the way." I told her about the gate, the rain encounter, the hand impression, the moved tape, the glove on the step. I kept my voice level, no folklore words, no dramatic language, just sequence and details. She stayed quiet until I finished. "Dustin," she said, and I could hear her shift into that clinical tone she used when things were serious. "Pack a bag, bring Boone, and come into town tonight. You can stay at my place or the motel by the clinic. Do not sleep out there another night. I can't leave Dad up here alone without warning." "Then go get him and both of you come down." "I'm not debating this. I need 1 more night to document." "No." She cut across me, sharper. "You are describing targeted behavior. That is not weather stress, and it is not a prank you wait out. Call your father right now." I said I would. She made me repeat it back before hanging up. External contact outcome was immediate. Belief from one person, pressure to evacuate. I called my father next. He did not pick up. Landline rang out. I grabbed keys and drove uphill to his place. He was in the shed splitting kindling, hearing protection on, and looked irritated more than surprised when I killed the truck in his yard. "What now?" he said, pulling muffs off. I gave him the short version with no softening. Gate bent. Prints cast. Things moved and placed. He stared at me, then at the tree line behind my truck. "You coming down to town tonight?" I said. "Both of us." He wiped sawdust from his hands with a rag. "I'm not leaving my house because you found a glove on your steps. It took my markers and put them where I'd see them. It knows where I move and when. Or somebody does. Then somebody 7 foot tall with claws bent my gate." He held my gaze a long time, jaw working once. I'll come down tomorrow after I lock things up. Tonight. Tomorrow. The old stubbornness in him hit the old stubbornness in me and sparked. I wanted to drag him to the truck like a child. Instead, I forced my voice down and said, "At least lock your doors and keep a loaded rifle where you can reach it." He gave one short nod. "You do the same." I left angrier than I should have been, because anger felt better than fear. On the drive back to my house, I checked mirrors every curve. Nothing obvious followed. Still, when I slowed for the dip near the drainage bridge, I saw movement in the tree line pacing my truck for maybe 4 seconds, just beyond headlight throw. A dark mass keeping exact speed without entering open ground. I hit the gas and it vanished behind trunks. At my driveway, I stopped, cut engine, and listened. 2 beat steps moved upslope parallel to the road, then stopped when I stepped out. That was the moment the framework in my head finally locked into place. It had not been wandering through. It had been mapping me. Work shift departures, return times, light patterns, where I stood to smoke, where Boone paused, where my father lived uphill, how long I took on fence checks, where the truck was pointed at night. It tested barriers, tested motion sensors, tested response time. It probed for panic and watched what I secured first. I was not just a witness to it. I was in its process. I went inside, shut every blind, and spread my notebook across the table with a county map. I marked each encounter point in red. Scrape line, shed smell pocket, eyes at timber, loader silhouette, rain gate contact, pacing near drainage bridge. The points formed a rough horseshoe around my house, with one open end toward Cotton Gin Road. A funnel, a pressure corridor. If I were tracking hogs, I would call that pattern driving behavior. I told myself I was still a practical man, still capable of acting on evidence instead of panic. The evidence now said one thing with brutal clarity. Staying put meant surrendering initiative. I packed a go bag in under 10 minutes. 2 changes of clothes, meds, cash envelope, charger pack, documents folder, spare batteries, first aid, flares, sidearm magazines, shotgun shells. I clipped Boone's lead on and kept him close while I loaded. I left one porch light on and killed the rest to reduce glare. Then I moved the truck to face straight down Cotton Gin Road, keys in ignition, engine off to avoid announcing departure. As full dark settled, a single thump hit the back wall of the house. Not loud, just intentional, like a knock from a hand too heavy for wood. Boone flattened to the floor. I did not look out the window this time. I stood in the kitchen with my palm on the door handle, timing my breath, waiting for the next sound and understanding for the first time in my life what it meant to be hunted on your own land. I kept my hand on that handle and counted to 20, listening for a second knock that never came. What came instead was a slow scrape along the siding, low at first, then rising, like claws testing grain direction in old wood. Boone made a sound I'd never heard from him, not bark, not whine, a thin throat noise that cut off midway as if he was afraid to finish it. I moved him into the laundry room, set his water bowl inside, dropped a blanket by the dryer, and shut the door so he could not bolt when I opened the back. I called my father first. No answer. Called again, straight to the machine after 4 rings. I called Kayla and kept my voice as level as I could while I told her I was leaving right then and heading for the highway station if I could not reach Dad on the way. She said my name twice in that firm tone she used when she needed me to focus. Stay on the main road, no shortcuts, no stopping for anything in the trees. If your truck acts up, Call 911 and keep moving on foot toward lights. You hear me? I hear you. You call me when you hit pavement with traffic. I promised I would. Then I called dispatch. The woman who answered sounded tired but polite. I gave my address, told her I had repeated property intrusion by a large unknown predator, aggressive behavior, and fresh contact on the house wall while I was inside. She asked if I had visual. I said not at that second. She asked if anyone was injured. I said not yet. Keyboard clicks, pause, then the line every rural caller learns to hate. Units were tied up on 2 crashes and a domestic call. Nearest deputy would be delayed. She told me to shelter in place unless immediate danger escalated. It already escalated, I said, looking at the back wall where the scrape had ended. I need somebody on this road now. I understand, sir. Keep doors secured. If it enters the residence, call back immediately. That was the outcome, logged, delayed, useless to the next 10 minutes. By a little after 10, I had made every call I could make and still had no one physically between me and whatever was outside. I grabbed my go-bag, sidearm, shotgun, flares, and keys. The thump came again, this time against the mudroom door, hard enough to rattle the deadbolt. I did not check the window. I stepped onto the porch, moved low along the rail, and reached the truck in one burst. The driver door opened, then stopped against pressure from outside the light cone, like something had bumped the panel and leaned away. I slid in anyway, locked all doors, and started the engine. Headlights flooded the yard. For half a second, the beam caught movement at the lower gate, a dark mass crossing left to right with a shoulder height above the top rail. Then it was gone, behind the barn. I reversed, tires spitting gravel, and backed into the turnaround with more throttle than was smart. The truck fishtailed, corrected, and pointed downhill toward Cotton Gin Road. As I passed the house, Boone slammed once against the laundry room door inside, then went silent. The road out of my place dropped through 2 tight bends before it met the main stretch, and every shadow between those bends looked occupied. Branches slapped the passenger side as I clipped too close to the ditch. I kept checking mirrors and seeing nothing stable enough to identify, just flashes of motion at tree-line pace that matched my speed for a few seconds, then dropped back. When I hit Cotton Gin Road proper, I put the truck in 4 high and drove for open distance, not comfort. Gravel shifted under me, headlights jumping with each rut, timber pressing close on both sides where the county never cut back brush. My phone showed 1 bar, then none. I tried my father again anyway, no connection. Tried Kayla. Failed call. I threw the phone onto the seat and tightened both hands on the wheel. The mine-spoil turnout passed on my left, pale under broken cloud. Loader still parked like a rusted landmark I had seen 1,000 times. I told myself to keep straight for the highway and not look. I looked anyway. At first I saw only the turnout and the loader tire. Then my headlights reached farther down the shoulder and lit 2 eyes at a height that made my stomach drop, amber green and steady, not reflecting fear, reflecting assessment. The shape unfolded from behind the loader in one fluid rise to full height and stepped onto the road. The engine died. No sputter warning, no stumble, just full power loss and sudden silence except tires crunching forward on momentum. Dash light stayed on. Headlight stayed on. Steering went heavy. I pumped the key once and got a dry click. Again, nothing. The truck rolled another 10 yards and stopped angled across the lane with the ditch on my right and spoil bank on my left. It stood in front of my hood inside the high beams, and for the first time there was no rain, no fog, No trunk line, no partial cover to break what I was seeing. It was close to 8 feet upright, maybe a little more if it fully extended its spine, with a dense black-brown coat that swallowed light except where guard hairs along the shoulders caught a copper edge. The chest was deep and barrel-wide, broader than any man I had known, with muscles stacked over the collar line and down into overbuilt forequarters that looked engineered for grappling force. Its neck rose too vertical for a canid, thick and corded, carrying a wolf-like head with an elongated muzzle, heavy jaw, and lips drawn just enough to show long canines wet with saliva that stretched and snapped as it breathed. The eyes were amber with a green flare in direct beam, set forward in a way that read predatory and focused, and I could feel intelligence in that gaze the way you feel heat from a stove before contact. Old scars crossed the right flank in pale tracks through shorter fur, healed and layered, like it had survived fights with things that could damage it. The forelimbs ended in hands, not paws, with long fingers tipped by curved claws pale against the dark coat, each claw long enough to hook metal seams. Its legs were digitigrade and spring-loaded, hocks high, stance slightly crouched, weight on the front half as if every pose was one decision away from explosive movement. When it inhaled, the rib cage expanded visibly. When it exhaled, the sound came out in rough chuffs with that same measured cadence I had heard in the storm. I knew right then that every rational theory I had used was finished. No bear stood like that. No man wore that shape. No misread shadow held eye contact and adjusted footing in loose gravel while reading my door handles and window lines. It moved first, a fast sidestep toward my driver door testing angle. I jammed the shifter into neutral and dropped the brake. The truck rolled backward downhill a few feet, enough to throw off its timing as it lunged. At the same instant, I fired one warning shot through the open side window into the shoulder beside it. The blast cracked the hollow and echoed off spoil banks. The creature flinched, not from fear but from sensory shock, head snapping away from muzzle flash. That gave me 2 seconds. I grabbed a road flare from the console, struck it on the dash edge, and threw it under its forward feet. Red-white fire hissed across wet gravel, smoke boiling low. Heat and sudden light changed the scene geometry, and it recoiled with a violent twist, claws gouging the road as it cleared the flare in one bound. Not retreating, repositioning. Then it hit the hood. Metal boomed, windshield starred, and safety glass sprayed my arms and neck. The hood dropped under weight, then sprang half back as it pushed off. I kicked the passenger door open and bailed with my bag strap, catching for one awful second on the seat lever before tearing free. I landed wrong on the ditch edge, slid through mud and gravel, and felt a hot rip of pain through my left shoulder that took my breath. I kept moving anyway, rolling down the embankment toward the culvert line I knew from years of hunting, that drainage for deer crossings. Behind me, claws raked the driver door with a scream of torn paint and punctured sheet metal. The truck rocked. Another impact. I scrambled on hands and boots through cattail stubble and hit the culvert mouth chest first, shoving into cold concrete shadow just as the creature reached the ditch lip above. It dropped down after me, but the culvert throat narrowed where runoff had shifted a slab years earlier. That choke point was barely wide enough for a man with a pack. It was not wide enough for those shoulders without turning sideways. I jammed myself behind the constriction, drew a breath that tasted like mud and rust, and brought the sidearm up two-handed despite the shoulder pains screaming through my arm. The creature forced one forelimb into the opening, claws scraping concrete, then withdrew and slammed the rim hard enough to shower grit. Its muzzle pushed into view for a split second. Teeth bared, eyes burning in reflected flare light from the road above. I fired 2 controlled shots into the gravel directly in front of the opening, not at random, at an angle to kick stone and spark toward its face. It snapped back with a guttural bark chuff and shifted left, trying to find a wider entry. I crawled deeper, came out the far side of the culvert, and rose into knee-high brush with my legs shaking. The road grade there climbed toward a utility turnout where the ditch opened. I ran for it, half stumbling, half sprinting, hearing it circle the culvert lip to intercept. It came over the bank 20 yards ahead, dropping to all fours for speed, then rising again as it closed distance with those elastic strides that erased ground. I planted my feet behind a gravel hump, front sight high on center mass, and fired once into its upper shoulder as it lunged. The round hit. I saw the impact torque its frame sideways, heard a raw, sustained howl roll out of it and tear across the hollow like metal bending. It crashed through brush, regained footing, then dropped to all fours and bounded for the timber, not straight away, but in a zigzag that used trunks for cover until darkness and slope swallowed it. The howl faded upslope, then cut off. I stood there shaking, pistol up, listening for a return charge that did not come. When I could move, I moved downhill, away from my truck, away from the turnout, following the road by memory and ditch markers with one headlight still glowing crooked behind me through trees. My left arm hung useless and hot. Glass cuts along my forearms and cheek, stung in cold air. I kept the pistol in my right hand and my thumb on the light switch. Every 10 steps I looked back. Nothing followed into open road. A mile later, maybe a little more, I saw sodium lights from the highway station through the bend and nearly dropped from relief and exhaustion at the same time. I crossed the lot in a stagger, reached the restroom vestibule, and locked myself in the far stall with my back to the tank and the pistol on my lap. My chest heaved so hard I thought I might black out. I called 911 again, and this time said plain words they could not file under nuisance. Vehicle disabled. Armed assault by unknown large predator. Injuries from crash glass. Immediate medical need. Location pinned at the station by mile marker. I stayed in that stall until I heard boots and radios outside and someone announcing state police by name. When I opened the door, the fluorescent light made everything look washed out and unreal. My sleeves dark with rain and mud. Tiny glass fragments still glittering on my cuffs. One trooper took the pistol, cleared it, and asked what happened. I told him an unknown large bipedal predator attacked my truck on Cotton Gin Road, and I escaped on foot after firing in self-defense. He held my gaze for a second, then nodded once and called for medical to move in. Outside, under the station canopy, I could still hear that howl in my head, long and wounded and furious, fading back into timber that no longer felt like home. Under the station canopy, adrenaline drained out of me so fast my knees buckled. A paramedic caught my elbow and guided me to the bumper of an ambulance, while another cut my shirt sleeve to check the shoulder. Glass glittered in my forearms and across my collarbone, tiny bright points under the white work lights. My hands would not stop shaking. When they asked my pain level, I told them my arm was on fire, and everything else felt far away, like my body had decided to postpone half of it until later. Kayla got there before they loaded me. She came through the automatic doors in scrubs and a borrowed jacket, hair tied back, face set hard in that clinical focus I had seen 100 times with patients. She took one look at me and pressed her lips tight. "You stayed alive," she said, and the words came out, half order, half relief. "Good, keep doing that." I tried calling from the road. "I know. Dispatch patched me after your second call." She looked past me toward the trooper taking notes by the cruiser. "Do not freelance this statement. Keep it factual." I nodded, then winced when the motion pulled my shoulder. The medic fitted a temporary brace and started flushing cuts with saline that stung like hot wire. Somewhere behind us, an officer was on the phone requesting a unit to secure my property and check on my father. That was the first moment I could think in sequence instead of bursts. Boone, Dad, house, evidence. I told the trooper Boone was locked in my laundry room and gave him my key code. He wrote it down and repeated it back to me without smiling. At the hospital, they did stitches, x-rays, and a concussion watch in a curtained bay that smelled like antiseptic and overheated coffee. Torn rotator cuff, they said, likely partial. Multiple superficial lacerations from safety glass. No fractures. I lay there with my left arm immobilized, staring at acoustic ceiling tiles while my mind replayed headlights on wet fur and claws folding over my door seam. At 3:40 in the morning, a state police investigator took my formal statement. I gave him what I could prove. Vehicle disabled under unknown conditions. Large bipedal predator. Direct attack. Defensive gunfire. Retreat into timber after one apparent shoulder hit. I did not say the folklore word. I did not say the part about eye contact feeling like negotiation. When he asked if I believed it was a bear, I said, "No, sir. I have seen bears. This was not a bear." Just after dawn, my father finally called. The nurse held the phone to my right ear because my hands were taped and stiff. "You hurt bad?" he asked. "Could be worse." Long pause, then quieter. Trooper came by. "Got Boone out. Dog's with me." I shut my eyes. "You all right?" "I am now," he said. "You were right to leave." By the third day after the attack, I was back at my place under escort from a wildlife officer and a trooper to gather essentials and document damage. My truck sat at an impound lot first. Driver door punched through in 3 places. Hood caved. Windshield cratered. The photos looked fake until I touched the metal and felt the inward folds with my own fingertips. Deputy Keller was there for part of the vehicle inspection. He did not offer shadow distortion that day. He stood with his hands on his belt, looking at the claw spacing, and said only, "I logged the supplemental report." At the house, every item I had collected went into one of 3 paths: submitted, copied, or abandoned with notation. I handed over the labeled fur samples from the freezer, both plaster casts, the SD card with static and high-set eye shine, and digital copies of every photo on 2 drives. I kept the original notebook and gave the investigator a scanned duplicate in town, because that notebook was the only timeline I trusted. The wildlife lab later reported canid markers in 1 hair sample but insufficient integrity for species match, heavy environmental contamination in the rest, and no conclusive identification from casts beyond atypical morphology. That phrase did not calm me. It just sounded cleaner than the truth. The strange placements got documented too. I had already photographed the tape tied to my mailbox flag and shed handle, the old shell standing on my hood, the glove on the step, the carpenter pencil in the post. The officer asked if any neighbor had access. I told him no, and my father confirmed it in front of him. Nobody ever claimed those movements. Nobody ever explained them. Dispatch did call back 2 days later with an incident follow-up number and a standard line about high call volume during storms. I wrote the number in the notebook margin and never expected anything from it. The county office classified my case as an assault by unknown animal with property damage. State police kept it open for 90 days, then closed active investigation pending new evidence. I got the letter in a thin envelope that felt lighter than it should have. 3 weeks after the hospital release, I sat in physical therapy, rotating my shoulder through bands while Kayla filled out emergency contact paperwork at the front desk because I could not print clean with my brace on. We were not getting back together. Both of us knew it. But trust returned in a practical form that mattered more than promises. She asked direct questions. I gave direct answers. That became our new ground. I made decisions fast after that because staying half committed to the hollow felt like baiting a trap. I transferred out of underground mining to a daylight equipment role near town. Lower pay, but predictable hours and less time on isolated roads before dawn. Curtis from the mine called when he heard. He was quiet for a second, then said, "I saw the truck photos. I was wrong." He did not try to turn it into a joke. That apology landed heavier than speeches. By early January, I listed the property. The first buyer backed out after inspection because of road access and storm damage. The second offered well below market, and I took it. Signing papers in the attorney office felt like amputating a limb you needed but could not save. My father sat beside me in his good flannel, saying nothing, just tapping one finger on his coffee cup. When we walked out, he looked back once toward the hills and said, "Land does not always love you back." That was the closest he ever came to naming what happened. He moved into the duplex with me the same week. 2 bedrooms, monitored exterior lighting, neighbors close enough to hear a shout. Staffed clinic 4 minutes away. We put Boone's bed in the hallway between our doors, and for months, that dog still chose the spot where he could see both of us at once. I installed layered cameras with battery backups and cellular failover after one winter outage taught me not to trust a single power source. Every vehicle got a trauma kit, 2 flares, a tourniquet, spare batteries, and a charged power bank. I carry a legal sidearm daily now, not for bravado, for lead time. The remaining physical evidence reached final disposition by spring. State returned my casts after analysis. 1 cracked during transport, and I stored both in sealed bins in the utility closet with desiccant packs. The hair sample remnants were consumed in testing. The SD card was copied and archived by investigators, and I kept the original in a fireproof box with the incident letters, medical records, and photos. The damaged truck was totaled by insurance, then retained for salvage. I kept the driver door panel section with puncture marks before release because seeing it reminds me that memory did not invent any of this. Nothing was left floating. I also closed the contact loop with the people who mattered. I met Deputy Keller in person to sign the final supplement. He avoided my eyes at first, then said, "For what it is worth, I do not think you imagined it." The trooper who took my statement called once more when the case closed and advised me to report any repeat pattern directly to state dispatch, not county routing. He never explained why. My father never admitted belief, in plain words, but he started checking the motion lights every night before bed. and stopped teasing me about lock checks. The loaded look between those first officers at the desk never got an apology, and maybe that is the point. Some people need the world to stay narrow so they can function in it. I live in eastern Kentucky now, still within reach of the ridges, but no longer at the end of a dead road. I work days on heavy equipment maintenance, finish by late afternoon, and drive home on routes with traffic and businesses open. I do not take back roads after dark in late fall if I can avoid it, especially on damp nights when scent hangs low and sound carries. Twice a month I sit in trauma counseling and do the boring, necessary work of teaching my nervous system that every creak is not a breach. White noise machines run in our duplex at night. Motion alerts ping my phone. I sleep more than I used to, though not as deep. Some effects stayed. I still check exits when I enter any building. I still map choke points and lines of sight without meaning to. If an insect chorus cuts out all at once, my shoulders lock before my mind catches up. Boone recovered enough to walk evenings again, but he never willingly crosses an unlit yard after sundown. My father and I talk more now, oddly enough. Short talks, practical talks, but warmer. We cook, we watch weather, we keep routine. Routine is a kind of medicine. I no longer argue with witnesses who describe predators that do not fit the manuals. I ask what they measured, what they smelled, what their animals did, what failed first, what pattern repeated. Sometimes there is a normal answer, sometimes there is not. The prevailing view in polite company is that stories like mine come from stress, darkness, and suggestibility. Evidence suggests those factors can distort perception, and I respect that. They did not put those holes in my truck door. They did not bend chain links 7 feet high. They did not pace my lights in sequence and test my gates from downwind. I do not claim to know what it was, where it came from, or whether the shoulder shot ended it. I can only tell you what is complete and true on my side of the line. On Cotton Gin Road, I encountered one intelligent predator that should not have existed in any framework I trusted. I survived because I shifted from disbelief to tactics fast enough, and because luck gave me a culvert at the right moment. Afterward, I reported what I could defend, moved when staying became denial, and built a life organized around preparation instead of pride. If you ever find yourself explaining away the same wrong detail for too long, stop explaining and start planning. That is the difference between a story you tell and a name on a report.